Here's what we intend to discuss. In an age of corporate totalitarianism, is our response reform or revolution, as Rosa Luxemburg asked? This seminar is going to explore the ideas that the great socialist feminist leader Luxemburg raised in light of our transformation into a corporate state. Are you all on board? Are you aware that that's what you're here for? Yeah. Okay, good. What you may not know, some of you, is that this discussion is the third in a series in which we've been looking at the left's classic texts and authors in the contemporary context. 2 years ago, in a room like this one, Chris Hedges, Rick Wolff, Cornel West, and I tackled Tom Paine and Common Sense. Last year, the two of them with Gail Dines took on Marx. Somehow they managed. Today, we're joined by the great Rosa Luxemburg scholar, Sandra Rein, an associate professor of political studies at the University of Alberta, and we're going to be discussing reform or revolution and the work of Rosa Luxemburg. To remind you, Rick Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a visiting professor at the New School, and the host of the nationally syndicated weekly radio program Economic Update. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author, most recently of Wages of Rebellion, the Moral Imperative of Revolt. I'm the host of the Laura Flanders Show on Link TV, Free Speech TV, Manhattan Neighborhood Network, and Telesur, as well as a contributing author to The Nation. You can find more of my programming at lauraflanders.com. I'm going to preside here as kind of introducer, interlocutor, shouter, and each speaker is going to present individually for about 10 to 12 minutes, followed by a moderated discussion of about half an hour to 45 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period, and our producer, Gina Kim, has distributed index cards on which you should write your questions, or we would love you to write your questions, and Gina will collect them. This session's going to run to about 6:45, or really exactly 6:45, at which point we're all going to run over to the plenary. So to get us started, I thought I would begin with just a little bit of scene setting. From Paine to Marx to Luxemburg, we've traveled quite a distance in this series, from the early years, you might say, of industrial capitalism, the growth of monopolies, cartels, globalization, and crisis, right through to the period of Rosa Luxemburg at the end of the 19th century, and the period where crisis is really the subject being chewed on. Another way of looking at it might be that we have gone from corsets to bras. That's the feminist analysis. Tom Paine, if you were here for the Tom Paine one, you will remember he apprenticed with a corset maker. Luxemburg, among other things, rejected the corset and embraced the bra, which gives you a sense of just how radical she was. Personally, given how bras fit most of them, I would say it was reformist, not revolution, but still. That's for a future session. The point is, Luxemburg was a phenomenon. A woman, a Jew, an immigrant, a Pole living in Germany, a person living with a disability. She was very young, in her 20s when she wrote her most important work. She faced prejudices galore, and she still rose to become one of the outstanding revolutionary figures of the pre-World War I generation. At the turn of the 19th century, she led the fight against the revisionist, or evolutionary as opposed to revolutionary train of thought, which argued that capitalism might not need to collapse or the proletarian revolt for socialism to be achieved, but rather that capitalism could be reformed gradually. Now, it's just possible that some of you, even at this august gathering of left scholars, namely the Left Forum, might not have read recently Edward Bernstein's theory of evolutionary reform. Or if you have, you might not have read it in the original German. Die Voraussetzungen des Sozialismus und die Aufgaben der Sozialdemokratie. No? Good. Well, don't worry. We have experts to hand, and we're going to conduct this particular seminar entirely or almost entirely in English, to the best of our ability. To kick things off, I'd ask you simply to imagine, exercise your creative thinking, and imagine, if you can, living in a time at the turn of a new century in which new technologies are everywhere on the rise, But corporate cartels are everywhere in control, not only of our economy, but also the political mechanisms of our society. Now imagine that wages are falling, trade unions are struggling, and wars of empire seem always to be breaking out. I know it's hard, but just try to imagine such a thing. Imagine further that a man is out there arguing that socialism can be advanced not by overturning the state, but by electing a self-described socialist to government. He's even talking about revolution. What is going on here? Is this moving toward socialism or away from it? I don't know where your mind could possibly have wandered off to, but the situation I've just described is more or less the one that Rosa Luxemburg found herself in very real life in the late 1890s. No nibbling liberal, Luxemburg accused Bernstein of, quote, proposing to change the sea of capitalist bitterness into a sea of socialist sweetness by progressively pouring into it bottles of social reformist lemonade. Reform or revolution? For our first whack at this somewhat relevant topic, Sandra Rein. Sandra.
So I will do my best to project. Again, if you need me to speak louder, do so. I grew up on a farm, and I'm very good at calling in animals, but I usually whistle. So we will do our best. Hard to follow, Laura, but thank you. And thank you very much to Professor Wolff for inviting me to join this forum and to be part of the series that probably many of you have been in attendance over the past while. For my part, I'm going to start the panel off with a more general introduction to the question of social reform and revolution as it was addressed by Luxemburg, and you've heard a little bit already. I want to provide some context to Luxemburg's work as a party activist, as an economist, and as an early feminist. And as such, I hope that Luxemburg's voice becomes something that we can hear in our own debates about socialism, revolution, and realizing an alternative to capitalism. I mean, we're still hanging on. So let's begin by thinking about what we may already know about Rosa Luxemburg. For many in the room, I suspect the first thing that comes to mind is the manner of her violent murder in 1919. In many ways, Rosa Luxemburg's martyrdom was for some time her most lasting legacy, and she was very often represented as a kind of iconic image, much like Che Guevara, and I'm sure there's some in the room. But less attention was paid to why the German government or state would see this woman as so dangerous. If your mind didn't go to her death, you may have found yourself recalling that she was a woman with a difficult and, let's say, complicated personal life, one that defied the cultural mores of her time. And if you've seen Von Trotte's film, I'm sure, have people seen the Rosa Luxemburg film? Yes? You would likely also have thought of both of these images, her murder and her complicated life, and added to them her resolute determination in the face of persistent sexism and discrimination within German social democracy and her long periods of incarceration. And all of these images are, of course, and many more, true in the sense that they are part of Luxemburg's life. But it is also the case that we are less likely to immediately think of her contributions to economic theory and Marxism, or her support for feminist ideas and organizations, or her numerous contributions to what I would term revolutionary philosophy and radical democracy. And yet the question of reform or revolution, a debate that has framed much of the 20th and 21st century socialism, is I might say, the question that Luxemburg took on from her earliest days in social democracy. This culminated in an extended essay in 1899 and revised for publication in 1908 that you know as Reform or Revolution. This is also the place in this essay at this time where she stands her ground in defense of dialectical thought and the centrality of the materialist conception of history, and she begins to define what she sees as democratic socialist politics. In 1899, you could say, and Laura hinted at this, that Rosa Luxemburg was also feeling the burn, a few of you may be. But her burn was much different. Bernstein incensed her. His theoretical work was providing justification for a reformist platform within social democracy, and was, according to Luxemburg at least, turning away from scientific socialism and a program that committed the revolutionary transformation of capitalist society. Challenging theoretical revisionism and opportunism was one of Luxemburg's key contributions to social democracy that combined with her outstanding organizing skills and commitment to the party school. There's a deep pedagogy in Rosa Luxemburg that we should pay attention to. From her first interventions at party conventions, Luxemburg proved that she was fearless and unlikely to be intimidated by the long-time male leadership within both German social democracy and the International. She was one of those women who didn't know her place very well, and that was recorded often in letters between the leadership later on. So I want to take the little bit of time I have to look in a more detailed way at the core concerns she raised in Reform or Revolution, not simply as they related to Bernstein's particular book, which the German title is quite awesome, translated as Evolutionary Socialism in English, which actually is kind of a mistranslation, I think. We could take that up. But how can these concerns that she had in 1899 continue to influence our thinking about revolutionary transformation, and how we might collectively work towards realizing that alternative socialist society, maybe one that's even lemonade sweet. Doesn't sound bad right now. So I'm from Canada, you might have picked that up. In Canadian politics, there's an old joke, and one I hope that will make sense to what I'm guessing is largely a US audience. The joke is that the new Democratic Party in Canada, that's our Social Democratic Party, is really just the Liberal Party, quote, in a hurry. In other words, liberal democracy will get there in time, and that the problem of social change is really just one of, to quote Rosa Luxemburg, duration rather than essence. And she really wanted to challenge that notion. This is very much the sentiment, though, that Bernstein was representing at the turn of the 20th century. His claim, and I'm not going to go into detail of his theory or evidence, was largely that capitalism itself was adapting in such a way that the deep crises that marked its early accumulation were lessening, and that through parliamentary means lasting reforms could be achieved that would realize socialism in an evolutionary rather than a revolutionary manner. This argument, according to Luxemburg, turned against scientific socialism and was a recipe for the ultimate failure of realizing a socialist program or pursuing revolutionary change through the party. Her argument is worth some serious consideration. And I think the microphone is on.
Yeah, try it.
So am I now too loud?
You're good.
Okay. Don't know. Maybe Siri turned it on. I heard her. So, sort of three items I want to look at. First, Luxemburg is very clear that social democracy must support social reforms and those who are demanding those reforms. She writes,
Gina, what do we need to do?
I'm just saying that you should get the microphone that
for social democracy, and I'm quoting, there exists an indissoluble tie between social reforms and revolution. The struggle for reforms is its means, the social revolution its goal.
All right, stop just like 1 second. Okay, what's happening? This will be for later?
You can walk around the just saying.
Oh, perfect.
Okay?
So whichever you prefer. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. Although it seems obvious to say that we should support social reforms, that of course any good socialist would want to support social reforms, it has in fact been a sticking point for various parties and movements since Luxemburg's time. I can recall in my own first exposures to Marxism being told, quote, worse is better. In other words, ameliorating social injustices and exploitation would only delay the reckoning day for capitalism. However, Luxemburg's simple statement in Reform or Revolution reminds us that without solidarity, without connection to the lived experience of people in struggle, not only is it impossible for the working class to learn its class consciousness, but we lose the important connection between theory and practice. The trick, if you will, is that we must avoid the trap of Bernstein. The movement cannot be everything, as he suggested. It must remain a means to an end. At one point in Reform or Revolution, Luxemburg concludes that Bernstein's advice to workers is to go to sleep. However, not connecting to social reforms, not entering into solidarity with various groups and people also is a form of going to sleep. So this is a difficult balance to achieve. For Luxemburg, the way to stay on track is to engage the world, to engage in thinking as well as acting. This brings us to the second important element in Reform or Revolution, where Luxemburg argues that Bernstein's theory is based on a method that sees capitalism as able to adapt so that future crises may be lessened or even averted, and production itself becomes increasingly varied. This elevates the status of the working class to the so-called middle strata, realizing these gains through productivity and trade union struggles. The adaptations Bernstein identifies includes the development of the credit system and the increased role of employers' organizations via cartels and trusts. At the time when they were writing, the sugar industry was the cartel of the time, but I think you can all conjure up OPEC as a similar type of organization. Moreover, Luxemburg tells us that Bernstein fundamentally misunderstands the role of the middle and small-sized enterprise, choosing to see their continued existence as proof that capitalism does not drive towards dominant large-scale industry. In essence, Luxemburg tells us that Bernstein has rejected the core of Marx's analysis of the breakdown of capitalism. Her argument was that because Bernstein did not understand the essential elements of the development of capitalism, how credit and cartels are necessary components, for example, which both allow for capitalist accumulation and exacerbate crisis, or that medium and small enterprises are the mechanisms of innovation and technological progress, he mistakes their presence as adaptations. And she says this may be unintentional, but he revises Marxist analysis such that the implication is that there is no objective necessity for socialism. This is important to Luxemburg. It is not that reformism changes the tactics and strategies of the party, because in fact it does very little, at least at the start, to change those tactics and strategies. But it's that it destroys the foundations for a critique of capitalism. Finally, you might start to wonder how Luxemburg advises us to avoid reformism and keep in mind the social revolution as the ultimate goal. One way is to think dialectically about the mechanisms of capitalist economy, how the interrelationships between credit and accumulation, for example, are both constructive and destructive, or how cartels both organize capitalist production and relocate surplus at the expense of other industries. In shorthand, she would tell us to keep Marxist ABCs, she loved the ABCs, at the forefront of our thinking. To at all times remember that capitalism is a system of value production, value that can only be realized through abstract human labor. So by economic necessity, capitalism's breakdown is inevitable, says Luxemburg. But does this mean that socialism is also inevitable? The answer is no. Socialism requires the revolutionary transformation of production as an economic necessity, but it also requires, and she's very clear about this, the seizure of political power. And the seizure of political power must be rooted in democratic practices. On the question of democracy, Luxemburg was absolutely unyielding. This became particularly apparent in her debates with the leaders of the International and in her stinging critique of the Russian Revolution. She says, and I'm quoting, The more democratic institutions, the livelier and stronger the pulse beat of the political life of the masses, the more direct and complete their influence. To be sure, every democratic institution has its limits and shortcomings, things which it doubtless shares with all other human institutions. But the remedy which Trotsky and Lenin have found, the elimination of democracy as such, is worse than the disease it is supposed to cure. For it stops up the very living source from which alone can come the correction of all the innate shortcomings of social institutions. That source is the active, untrammeled, energetic political life of the broadest masses of people. So today, in the face of two seemingly contradictory and insurmountable forces, that is the rise in almost immeasurable corporate power and wealth, and the continued exercise of state power through militarism, regulation, and austerity, reform or revolution is not simply a question of the 20th century German polity, but it is our question, and Luxemburg asks us to rethink it so that we ask, how do we do reform and revolution?